Hi everybody. Today we'll be finishing up our discussion of the Civil War. The months immediately following the Battle of Antietam and the issuance of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation were not kind to the North and the Army of the Potomac. The new commander of the military effort in the East, Ambrose E. Burnside, who we see here, was determined to display the kind of fighting spirit that his predecessor, George B. McClellan, so conspicuously lacked. In December 1862, with an army of 113,000 men, Burnside attacked Robert E. Lee's 74,000-man force at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Unfortunately, logistical mishaps delayed the Union Army advance, allowing Lee time to organize his defense along a 7-mile stretch of hills south and west of the town of Fredericksburg. This map details the organization of what came to be known as the Battle of Fredericksburg. On the morning of the 13th, Burnside launched his assault, which began with a briefly successful but ultimately failed attempt to cripple the right flank of Lee's army, where Stonewall Jackson occupied the hills south of the town. The inability of the Union forces to penetrate the right flank of the rebel defense foreshadowed much worse to come, because Burnside's attack on the Confederate left never had a chance to succeed. The new Union commander did demonstrate the fighting spirit expected of him, but not the judgment. This illustration of the assault on what was known as Marye's Heights shows what the Union troops were up against. A half-mile stretch of open ground toward the heights, where Lee's artillery was waiting for them, and at the foot of the heights, row upon row of riflemen, commanded by General James Longstreet. In an incredible and suicidal act of bravery, which moved witnesses on both sides, the Army of the Potomac, at Burnside's command, launched 7 attempts to take Marye's Heights. All were tragic, horrific failures. For his part, Burnside, openly weeping after the last charge, said that he himself would lead yet another the next morning. His subordinates talked him out of it. More than 12,000 men in blue uniforms lay dead on the field. Once again, the Union Army had to retreat in defeat and disgrace toward Washington. While the South breathed a sigh of relief after Fredericksburg, Northern despair became acute. Harper's Weekly cried out that the people were filled with anguish. "They've borne," said the paper, "silently and grimly, imbecility, treachery, failure, privation, loss of friends and means, almost every suffering which can afflict a brave people. But they cannot be expected to suffer that such massacres as this at Fredericksburg shall be repeated." When Lincoln learned of the outcome at Fredericksburg, he said to an associate, "If there's a worse place than hell, I'm in it." Morale in the Army of the Potomac dropped to an all-time low after the catastrophe at Fredericksburg. Burnside offered his resignation, which was accepted. Lincoln then placed Joseph Hooker, who we see here, in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker was a popular choice at the time. He was well liked by the troops and was popular with the public after acquitting himself well at the Battle of Antietam months earlier. Hooker built morale back up, cleaned up the camps, got the troops better food, and in general improved the discipline and fighting spirit of the army. He boasted that he hoped God would have mercy on the rebels, for he would have none. That kind of talk worried the president, who feared it was a mask covering larger insecurities in Hooker. He was correct. Despite having an excellent plan, when Hooker's 115,000-man army met up with Robert E. Lee's force of 60,000 at a place called Chancellorsville in Virginia in May 1863, nothing went right for the Army of the Potomac, beginning with the judgment of its commanding general, Joe Hooker. By April 30th, the logistical part of Hooker's plan was in place. This map shows the layout of what became known as the Battle of Chancellorsville. Hooker had 40,000 bluecoats facing Lee's army, still at Fredericksburg, while his much larger force of 70,000 had crossed the Rappahannock River and was only 8 miles from Lee's rear at Chancellorsville. Lee had to decide what to do quickly. He chose to leave 10,000 troops to defend Fredericksburg under the command of General Jubal Early, while he took the remaining 40,000 toward Chancellorsville. On the morning of May 1st, 1863, the Union forces pushed out into the clearing just beyond the woods, known as the Wilderness. But when they came into contact with the advance units of Lee's army, Hooker ordered a retreat back to the cover of the forest. His officers protested that such a move would relinquish the initiative to Lee, handicapping their artillery and diminishing the impact of their superiority in numbers. Lee, sensing that Hooker had lost his nerve, took a huge risk by dividing again his already split forces, sending Stonewall Jackson and 28,000 men on a massive flanking maneuver around the Union right flank. All day long, on May 2nd, Union pickets sent reports to Hooker about a large rebel force moving around his exposed right, but he ignored them. At 5:30 p.m., Jackson's men came screaming out of the woods and annihilated Hooker's right flank, driving it back some 2 miles before nightfall finally brought the attack to a halt. The only fateful blow struck against the Confederacy at Chancellorsville followed. Stonewall Jackson, not satisfied with the results of the late assault, rode out himself to scout for a rare night attack. As he was returning, nervous rebel pickets, mistaking him for the enemy, opened fire. The general was severely wounded. The next morning his left arm was amputated. He soon contracted pneumonia, and within several more days was dead. Despite the disaster on his right flank, Hooker, on the morning of May 3rd, still faced a good chance for victory. Lee's forces were still divided, and he still dramatically outnumbered them. But again, he made a critical error in judgment. Hazel Grove was one of the few clearings in the wilderness from which artillery could operate effectively. Hooker mistook the location for an exposed salient and ordered it abandoned at dawn. Lee's rebels quickly moved 50 guns up onto the hill and opened a devastating artillery fire, while simultaneously launching repeated infantry assaults on the Union positions up and down the lines at Chancellorsville. Hooker himself was stunned by an artillery shell in the fighting, but refused to relinquish command. In the middle of the morning, he finally ordered a full retreat. Lee took advantage of this opportunity to turn his forces back toward Fredericksburg to deal with the much smaller Union force that was still there, easily defeating them. Chancellorsville proved to be a worse disaster than Fredericksburg had been. Here we have an illustration from the battle. Over 17,000 Union forces were lost. President Lincoln received the news, according to an eyewitness, with an ashen face, declaring, my God, what will the country say?" Coming on the heels of the other failures and disasters in the Eastern theater of the war, Chancellorsville might have turned out to be a mortal blow to the Union cause. Instead, it turned out to be the darkness before the dawn, because Robert E. Lee, who we see again here, now believing his Army of Northern Virginia and he himself to be invincible, made the fateful decision for a second time to invade the North. His destiny and that of the Confederacy, as it turned out, now led to the rolling green fields of Pennsylvania and a little place called Gettysburg that we see here in this photograph as it looked in 1863. Just before 150,000 Union and Confederate troops descended upon it for the greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. After the debacle at Chancellorsville, Lincoln relieved Hooker of his post. The new Union commander was George Gordon Meade, a bookish and stern disciplinarian who his subordinates referred to as a damned old goggle-eyed snapping turtle. Here we have a picture of him. As a native Pennsylvanian, when he learned of Lee's movements, Meade was determined to crush the army that dared invade his native state. He was quickly in hot pursuit. The Battle of Gettysburg was an ongoing series of escalating engagements fought over the first few days of July 1863. On the first day's action, indicated on this map, as the forces of both sides began to arrive at the town, rebel infantry came under fire from some dismounted Union cavalry. More units continued to arrive throughout the day until some 27,000 Confederates and 23,000 Union forces ultimately clashed. It was a bitter struggle on the part of the slightly outnumbered Union forces to hold on to the high ground at Gettysburg, which they did, still occupying the heights of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill as night fell. 9,000 blue and 6,000 gray troops were either wounded or killed, some of whom we see here. But compared to what was coming, the first day had been a skirmish. Overnight, more rebel and Union forces converged on the small town. This map shows the second day's action. Late in the afternoon on July 2nd, Lee launched a ferocious assault on the Union left flank at the site of what were known as the Big and Little Round Tops. For hours, the Union troops positioned there desperately fought to retain control of the heights. Heavy casualties on both sides were suffered as the fighting raged into places with names like the Wheat Field and Devil's Den at the foot of the Round Tops. Lee even launched another attack on the Union right flank at night that tried to take Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill as he had at the end of the first day. All the rebel offensives were ultimately repulsed. The bloodshed of the second day, captured in these images from Little Round Top and from the Devil's Den, resulted in no major advantage for either side. Both armies essentially occupied the same ground they had at the start of the fighting. Despite his heavy losses, Lee convinced himself that because of his major assaults on both the Union right and left flanks, Meade must have weakened the middle of his lines. He decided that an all-out attack on the Union center on the third day would bring him and the Army of Northern Virginia the victory that had thus far eluded him. But his opponent, General Meade, saw it coming and was ready when the final day at Gettysburg dawned. This map shows the last day's action. The Union guns stacked along the heights of Cemetery Ridge should have reminded Lee of Fredericksburg and the suffering he inflicted on Burnside's ill-fated men. In fact, when General George Pickett led his troops out of the woods across the open field toward the ridge on the third day, the Union soldiers waiting for them began to chant, loud enough for the rebels to hear over and over, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." When Pickett's 13,000-man division had advanced far enough, the Union guns opened fire, and according to eyewitnesses, a great collective moan went up from the rebel lines. Only in one spot did Pickett's charge end up breaching the walls of the ridge, but it was quickly reinforced. Pickett was horrified. As he retreated across the battlefield, Lee himself rode out to meet him, ordering the general to rally what was left of his division in case of a Union counterattack. Pickett reportedly replied, "General Lee, I have no division now." He never forgave Lee, years later still telling friends, "That old man had my division slaughtered." On the other side, the Union forces were jubilant. The next day, as Lee prepared for a retreat, they celebrated the best 4th of July of their lives. Roughly a third of those engaged, some 50,000 men, were killed or wounded at Gettysburg over the 3 days of fighting. This represented over 20% of the Union forces, but nearly 40% of Lee's army was lost. All Southern hopes of invading the North again were over. The Confederacy could not afford such losses. By this point in the war, it could no longer easily replace the soldiers it was losing. The North faced no such problem. As Lee retreated toward Virginia, he did so knowing that his days of taking the offensive were over. It would be a purely defensive war moving forward, and a desperate one at that, so long as the conflict lasted. Gettysburg proved to be the high water mark of the Confederacy. The small town of Gettysburg itself, with a population of not quite 2,500 residents, as this photograph from the battlefield shows, now had to bury many thousands of dead men and horses and care for tens of thousands of wounded soldiers from both sides. Virtually every home and building had to be converted into a makeshift hospital The signs of the devastation and the smells were still evident when President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery in November 1863, declaring that those lost would not be allowed to have died in vain, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, as he put it, would not perish from the earth. The famous Gettysburg Address was so short, just a few minutes, and to the point, that photographers barely had time to get their shutters opened before the president was on his way back to his seat. This is the only surviving picture of Lincoln at Gettysburg. Despite the wound inflicted on Lee's army in Pennsylvania, the president was once again dismayed at the lack of killer instinct in his commanding general. Meade had allowed Lee to escape and retreat to Virginia to fight another day. Lincoln still could not find an officer with the fighting spirit he needed. But out in the western theater of the war, such a commander did exist. On the 4th of July, 1863, Ulysses S. Grant, who we see again here, forced the surrender of Vicksburg on the Mississippi after a siege of many months. His string of victories in the West convinced Lincoln to bring him to Washington to take command of all Union forces as the new General-in-Chief. Lincoln conferred on Grant the rank of Lieutenant General, not held since George Washington. But Grant had no intention of sitting behind a desk in the nation's capital plotting strategy. He would make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, becoming, in effect, its strategic field commander, while General George Meade remained its regular tactical commander. Lincoln at last had a general in charge whose strategic ideas accorded with his own. He could trust Grant to act decisively without the constant prodding necessary with previous commanders. For 2 years, Lincoln had been trying to get his armies to advance simultaneously on several fronts, and now Grant worked out such a plan. The Army of the Potomac, with about 115,000 men, would attack the 64,000-strong Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's army will be your objective point, Grant told Meade. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. On May 5th and on the 6th, 1864, Grant met Lee for the first time in what became known as the Battle of the Wilderness, depicted in this illustration. He lost 17,000 men, the same number Hooker had lost a year earlier, in virtually the same spot as the Battle of Chancellorsville. But what was different about Grant became apparent in the wake of the fighting at the Wilderness. Rather than ordering a retreat, as all previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac had done after suffering a defeat at the hands of Lee's army, Grant ordered a flanking maneuver to try and get around Lee's forces, in other words, between them and Richmond, in a bid to force him into an open battle. The Union Army was not going to retreat, ever again. As Grant wired the president, "I intend to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Morale in the Union ranks skyrocketed when the troops realized for the first time the stuff their new commander was made of. As one of them put it, Grant doesn't scare worth a damn. This map shows the strategy Grant pursued. Essentially, a series of flanking maneuvers, trying constantly to get around and between Lee and the rebel capital of Richmond. Each time, Lee anticipated the moves and countered with new entrenchments and defensive lines to stall and delay Grant and the Union forces. Major battles were fought at places such as Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, where the Union suffered a defeat not unlike Fredericksburg, seeing 7,000 men mowed down in a matter of minutes. It was the one mistake Grant admitted publicly he regretted most during the war. By the time Grant and the Union Army arrived at Petersburg, Virginia, in mid-June 1864, they'd lost 64,000 men. Lee also had lost half his army between the Wilderness and Petersburg, but what was left of it was now ensconced within miles and miles of heavily fortified earthworks. Grant reluctantly, as he had at Vicksburg, settled in for a siege he had hoped to avoid. Next to Virginia, the most important theater of the conflict in 1864 was Georgia, where General William Tecumseh Sherman's 100,000-man army faced Joseph E. Johnston's 65,000 Confederates. Grant directed Sherman to move against Johnston's army, to break it up, and to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources. Here we have a photograph of Sherman with his officer staff. His mission, in other words, was to destroy the South's capacity to make war. His initial target was Atlanta, Georgia. Between May and July 1864, Sherman's army inflicted nearly 28,000 casualties on General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederates, while suffering only 25,000 casualties themselves. By contrast, in the Virginia theater, while Lee's army had lost about 36,000 between the Wilderness and Petersburg, they had exacted nearly twice that number in return. This contrast in casualty ratios reflected the different tactics in the two theaters. Grant and Lee both favored attack and all-out battle as a means of destroying the enemy. Sherman and Johnston engaged in a war of maneuver. Rather than assault the Confederate strong defensive positions, Sherman executed a series of flanking movements that forced Johnston repeatedly to fall back to protect his communications. Only once, at Kennesaw Mountain, did Sherman order a frontal assault, with no more success than Grant at Cold Harbor. Although Johnston retreated toward Atlanta, as Lee did toward Richmond, such maneuvers in Virginia usually occurred after big battles. In Georgia, they occurred without large-scale fighting. Dissatisfied with Johnston's strategy, Jefferson Davis replaced him with General John B. Hood, who did try to attack Sherman's army, but was defeated with heavy losses 3 times on a retreat back to the trenches of Atlanta, where Sherman, like Grant at Petersburg, settled in for a siege at the end of July 1864. Northern war weariness in the summer of 1864, brought on by both Grant and Sherman's stalled offensives in front of Petersburg and Atlanta, revived the prospects of the peace wing of the Democratic Party. Peace sentiment seemed to have gained so much momentum that some Republicans despaired of the party's chances in the fall elections. The Democrats shrewdly chose to nominate former Union General George B. McClellan for president. Here we see a broadside for the Democratic ticket in 1864. Party leaders, recognizing his popularity with the troops while he was their commander, expected a large soldier vote for McClellan. Lincoln and the Republicans, emphasizing the preservation of the country, not peace at any price, temporarily changed their name to the Union Party and placed the war Democrat from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, on the ticket. Here's a Union Party banner from the election. August proved to be a crucial month because it marked the beginning of a string of Union victories that finally brought an end to the Union's 1864 summer of discontent and mocked the Democrats' description of the war as a failure. Mobile, Alabama, lay at the head of a bay whose entrance 30 miles to the south was protected by 3 forts, a minefield, and 4 gunboats, including the huge ironclad Tennessee. Admiral David G. Farragut, who we see again here, assembled 14 wooden ships and 4 ironclads to hammer the forts from the sea, while 5,500 blue soldiers assaulted them by land. On the morning of August 5th, the Union fleet engaged the forts in a spectacular duel of heavy guns. Suddenly, the leading Union ironclad blew up and sank, the victim of a mine. This brought the fleet to a halt under a punishing fire from the 2 largest forts. But Farragut took his wooden flagship, Hartford, to the head of the line, where he gave the order that immortalized him in the annals of the U.S. Navy. Damn the torpedoes. Full speed ahead. Here we have an illustration of the Battle of Mobile Bay. The Hartford pushed through the minefield safely. The fleet followed, and after passing into Mobile Bay beyond range of the forts, the Union ships turned their attention to the Confederate gunboats and pounded them into submission. Even the ironclad Tennessee, her rudder chains shot away and her commander wounded, was forced to surrender. A little over a week later, this victory was surpassed when Sherman finally captured Atlanta at the beginning of September. Here we have a picture of Sherman on his horse, just on the outskirts of the city. With Atlanta's fall, Lincoln's re-election prospects increased dramatically. The end of the war was finally in sight. On August 31st and September 1st, Sherman's troops fought and defeated the Confederates just outside Atlanta at Jonesboro. Here we have an illustration of the battle. General Hood, the rebel commander, for fear of being surrounded, was forced to evacuate Atlanta on the night of September 1st. The next day, Sherman's men marched in and occupied the city. The news electrified the North. as one New Yorker put it at the time, it is, coming at this political crisis, the greatest event of the war. Hood's retreating rebels had set fire to nearly everything of military value in the city before they left. But what they forgot, Sherman's men finished off. The general had not forgotten Grant's order to do all he could to destroy the South's ability to make war. Here we have a few illustrations of the burning of Atlanta and a couple of real photographs of the damage. The first sketch here shows the destruction of munitions factories and public buildings. And the next two capture the orange glow enveloping the city that eyewitnesses remarked so much upon at the time. The first actual photograph here shows the damage to buildings throughout the town, as does this one, an image from Atlanta's famous Peachtree Street in the wake of Sherman's invasion. The general was far from finished, but before his men left Atlanta, there was a presidential election for his soldiers to vote in. The 1864 election was a referendum on the war and emancipation. No one could be entirely sure what the consequences of a Democratic victory would be. Confederate independence, restoration of the Union with slavery, or something else. But the consequences of a Republican victory were certain: the doom of slavery and the continuation of war until the South surrendered. Knowing this, voters went to the polls on November 8th and re-elected Lincoln by a majority of 212 to 21 in the Electoral College. McClellan carried only New Jersey, his home state, Kentucky, and Delaware. Lincoln took 55% of the popular vote, a considerable increase over his 39% 4 years earlier. Only one free state, McClellan's New Jersey, elected a Democratic governor in 1864. Republicans gained control of all the state legislatures lost in 1862 and won an extraordinary 145 of the 185 seats in the next House of Representatives. The Senate would have a 42 to 10 Republican majority. Here we see the New York Times front page from November 9th, reporting the news of Lincoln's triumph. One remarkable fact about the 1864 election was that it took place at all. No other country before World War II held general elections in the middle of a war. The American experiment of holding an election during a civil war, whose result would determine the nation's future, is unique in history. Yet no one in 1864 proposed to postpone the election. As Lincoln himself explained, we cannot have free government without elections. And if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. The outcome, said Lincoln after his re-election, proved that, as he put it, a people's government can sustain a national election even in the midst of a great civil war. Equally remarkable was the soldier vote in 1864. No other society had tried the experiment of letting its fighting men vote in an election that might decide whether they were to continue fighting. Although McClellan's name still evoked enthusiasm among many officers and soldiers, few wished to vote for a party that declared the war a failure. Lincoln won an amazing 78% of the soldier vote in 1864. Even in the Army of the Potomac, only 29% of the men voted for McClellan. On November 15th, Sherman's army, over 60,000 strong, left Atlanta. The general was headed for the Atlantic coast and the city of Savannah. It was the start of his legendary March to the Sea. This map details the route he took. For over 3 weeks, the army covered 10 miles a day, burning and pillaging a 50-mile-wide path of destruction all the way to the ocean. By December 10th, Sherman was on the outskirts of Savannah, and rather than face capture, the 10,000 rebels defending it evacuated the town on December 21st. In a typically jaunty gesture, Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." Published in northern newspapers on Christmas Eve, this telegram set off another wave of celebrations across the North. By February 1865, Sherman's 60,000 troops were ready to bring the scourge of war to South Carolina in a campaign more devastating than their march from Atlanta to the sea. Sherman's intent was to smash his way through the Carolinas, destroying all war resources in his path and spreading demoralization among the populace as he moved up on Lee's rear to catch the Army of Northern Virginia in a vice between his army and Grant's. Sherman feinted one wing of his army toward Charleston and the other toward Augusta. The Confederates sent reinforcements to both cities, but Sherman pushed straight northward, cutting the railroad between the two cities without going near either. With its communications to the interior cut off, Charleston surrendered on February 18th. The Union officer who formally received the surrender was the colonel of a black regiment. His men were the first to take possession of the proud city, where some of them had been slaves. They marched in singing John Brown's Body, while Charleston's black population cheered. Queen City of the South, the taproot of secession, Charleston's fall was the most dramatic sign of the Confederacy's collapse. "The disappointment is to me extremely bitter," wrote Jefferson Davis. Here's a photograph of the ruins of Charleston after Sherman's men were done with it. In Northern eyes, the state of South Carolina deserved special punishment for its fire-eating role in bringing about the war. Sherman reported that the whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. "I almost tremble at her fate," but feel that she deserves all that's in store for her. Sherman's orders in the Palmetto State were the same as in Georgia: seize or destroy all forage and property of military value, but leave civilian property alone. The troops respected these orders even less than they had in Georgia, and Sherman did little to restrain them. A pillaging private put it succinctly: "Here is where treason began, and by God, here is where it shall end." The greatest outrage charged against Sherman was the burning of the state capital, Columbia. Union soldiers entered the city on February 17th, and by the next morning, half the city was in ashes. Here are a couple of photos of what it looked like. When his famous march to the sea and up the Atlantic coast was over, Sherman's troops left behind them 425 miles of desolation that would never again support a rebel army. In 1861, many foreign observers had considered the Confederacy unconquerable because its large area, poor roads, and rugged terrain would defeat an invader, just as Russia's vast distances had defeated Napoleon. But contrary to predictions, the South was not only invaded and conquered, it was destroyed. By 1865, the Union forces had penetrated every corner of 500,000 square miles of the Confederacy, a territory as large as France, Spain, and West Germany combined. These forces wiped out 2/3 of the assessed value of Southern wealth, 2/5 of the South's livestock, and 1/4 of her white men between the ages of 20 and 40. More than half the farm machinery was ruined, and the damage to railroads and industries was almost immeasurable. While total northern wealth increased by 50% from 1860 to 1870, southern wealth decreased by 60%. These figures testify to the capacity of a modernizing society to overcome the barriers of distance and terrain in history's first truly modern war. In March and April 1865, while Sherman continued making his way northward toward Virginia, Grant and the Army of the Potomac finally brought Robert E. Lee's rebel army to bay. Although a Westerner, Grant was sensitive to the Eastern Army's pride. Thus, he was anxious to finish the war before Sherman's army came up on Lee's rear and took credit for the final victory. Grant's greatest worry was that he would wake up one morning to find that Lee's army had slipped away during the night to join forces with General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. This was precisely what Lee intended to do. Before pulling out of the trenches, however, he gambled on one last assault against Grant's right, east of Petersburg, to compel him to shorten his encircling lines by sending reinforcements from the left. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 25th, sham Confederate deserters who'd been fraternizing with Union pickets, suddenly seized the surprised Yankees and spearheaded an attack that captured Fort Stedman, an earthwork in the Union line. Rebel brigades poured through the gap and soon occupied nearly a mile of Union trenches, but they could not hold them in the face of enfilading artillery fire and an infantry counterattack. By mid-morning, the rebels had been driven back with the loss of 4,800 men. Grant, who we see again here, now seized the initiative. He sent 2 infantry corps and 12,000 cavalry troops to flank the Confederate right, tear up the last open railroad into Petersburg, and block Lee's escape route to the southwest. At a road junction called Five Forks, General Phil Sheridan's cavalry and the 5th Corps on April 1st struck 10,000 Confederates in front and flank and routed them, inflicting more than 5,000 casualties at a cost of only 1,000 to themselves. When Grant learned of Sheridan's success, he ordered an assault all along the Petersburg lines at dawn the next day, which we see depicted here in this illustration. The remaining Confederates put up a desperate struggle, falling back from one line of trenches to the next during a long and bloody day that cost the Union 4,000 killed and wounded. Grant hoped to trap Lee's army in Petersburg, but during the night the rebels escaped across the Appomattox River and retreated westward. Meanwhile, the Confederate government and all troops in the area evacuated Richmond after blowing up bridges, factories, and arsenals, and burning all tobacco and government property that could not be removed. By dawn on April 3rd, Richmond was a blazing inferno. Here we have an illustration of the fires and some photographs of the devastation in Richmond. While the rebel capital burned, Lee's remaining army of 35,000 was trying to escape from 80,000 Union forces who were in hot pursuit. Sheridan's cavalry and 2 infantry corps raced parallel to the fleeing Confederates on their left to prevent Lee from turning southward, while 2 other infantry corps stayed on their rear, picking up hundreds of exhausted rebel stragglers. On April 6, at Sailor's Creek near Farmville, Grant's forces cut off and captured 7,000 Confederates after a battle in which the Union lost only 1,200 men. On April 8th, Sheridan got in front of what was left of Lee's army and captured 2 trainloads of rations at Appomattox Station, 100 miles west of Petersburg. When a final Confederate attempt to break through the encircling ring on the morning of April 9 revealed 2 Blue Infantry Corps in line behind the cavalry, Lee finally realized that the game was up. One of his artillery officers suggested that the army scatter to the woods and carry on the war as guerrillas, but Lee would have none of it. No, he said, There's nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. But go he did, to the house of Wilmer McLean in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Ironically, McLean had owned a house near Manassas, Virginia, in 1861 that had been used as a Confederate headquarters during the first battle of Bull Run. Now he would witness the final act of the war in his living room. The only general in American history to capture 3 separate armies at Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and now Appomattox. Grant proposed generous terms that paroled Lee's whole army and allowed them to take their horses and even their sidearms home with them. Here we have a painting of the famous surrender at Appomattox. As news of the surrender spread through Union camps on April 9th, the soldiers began to celebrate as if all the 4th of July in history had been rolled into one. The air is black with hats and boots, coats, knapsacks, shirts, and even cartridge boxes, wrote one veteran who tried to describe the scene. They fall on each other's necks and laugh and cry by turns. Huge, lumbering, bearded men embrace and kiss like schoolgirls, then dance and sing and shout, stand on their heads, and play leapfrog with each other. As the telegraph flashed the news of Lee's surrender through the North, which was just recovering from its celebration of the fall of Richmond, new and wilder jubilations broke out. The rejoicing, however, suddenly turned to grief, as once more the telegraph clicked out momentous news, but this time news of terrible, grave import: the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. On April 14th, the careworn 56-year-old president had relaxed by attending a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington. In the middle of the play, John Wilkes Booth gained entrance to Lincoln's box and shot him in the head, just behind the right ear. This sketch from the time captured the scene. Jumping down to the stage where he broke his leg, Booth reportedly shouted the Virginia state motto, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and managed to hobble out a rear door of the theater, where he made good his escape on horseback before anyone could apprehend him. The son and brother of famous actors, while a mediocre actor himself, the 26-year-old Booth was a frustrated, unstable egotist thirsting for fame. He'd plotted for months to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage for concessions to the Confederacy. To help in his mad scheme, he recruited several allies from Washington's underworld of drifters, rebel spies, and Confederate deserters. The fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender ruined the kidnapping venture, so Booth decided instead to murder Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. The accomplice assigned to assassinate Johnson lost his nerve. Seward suffered serious stabbing wounds, but survived. On April 26, Union troops finally tracked down Booth and shot him to death in a burning barn in Virginia. A military court convicted 8 accomplices of collusion in the assassination. 4 were hanged, and the rest were sentenced to imprisonment at hard labor. On April 15th, 1865, Andrew Johnson took the oath as president of a nation in shock and mourning. People wept in the streets for the martyred Lincoln. General Grant wept openly during the funeral services in the White House on April 19th. Millions stood silently along the tracks as a 9-car train carried Lincoln's body the 1,000 miles from Washington back home to Springfield, Illinois. Here we have some photographs. The first shows the funeral procession through the streets of Washington, D.C. And here the scene outside of New York City's City Hall, where thousands waited for a chance to walk past the president's body, laying in state in an open coffin, which we see here. The final photograph shows the Lincoln funeral procession down New York's famous Broadway Avenue. In a nation with an abiding religious heritage, the murder of the president on Good Friday seemed to be more than a coincidence. For black people especially, Lincoln's death at the moment of victory over slavery made of him a Christ-like figure. The event clothed with new meaning the last verse of Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Anger, as well as sorrow, marked the Northern mood in the weeks after the assassination. There were bitter cries of vengeance, not only against the assassination conspirators, but against all Confederate leaders, who were considered to be ultimately responsible for the death not only of Lincoln, but also of the 360,000 Union soldiers who'd been killed in the war. But such cries were contrary to the moving peroration of Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he had declared, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds and to achieve a just and a lasting peace." During the weeks after Lincoln's death, while Andrew Johnson was trying to get accustomed to his new office, and several Confederate armies were still in the field, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton was the government's strongman. Here we have a photograph of him. Brusque and excitable, Stanton feared that the assassination was part of a rebel plot to overthrow the government. Under his orders, hundreds of Confederate sympathizers were arrested. Those implicated in the assassination were harshly treated, and their legal rights all but ignored. In the midst of these events came news of the surrender of General Joseph E. Johnston's rebel army to Sherman, who negotiated a surrender agreement with Johnston on April 26 that duplicated the terms between Lee and Grant at Appomattox. Everyone in Washington, Stanton most of all, was under great pressure during the weeks after the assassination. Although Lee had surrendered, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet remained at large. At every stop, Davis exhorted his people to fight on. Even after Johnston surrendered, Davis spoke of moving the government to the Trans-Mississippi states and carrying on the war. To the Union government, it appeared that guerrilla warfare might go on for years, turning the South into another Ireland. But most Southerners had had more than enough. In Alabama, on May 4th, General Richard Taylor surrendered the remaining rebel forces east of the Mississippi. Union cavalry captured Jefferson Davis and his entourage in Georgia on May 10th. On May 26th, General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the Trans-Mississippi Army. These events of May brightened the skies in Washington. The problems of peace still lay ahead, but the war was over. Two feared consequences of the Civil War did not materialize. First, there was no bloodbath of vengeance. No Confederates were tried for treason. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned without trial for 2 years, but then released to live a quiet life and write his memoirs. This absence of reprisals was almost unique in the history of rebellions, especially those waged on the scale of this one. Second, the Army did not become a power in American life. To be sure, every elected president until 1904, save one, Grover Cleveland, had fought in the Union Army and owed his political success, at least in part, to his war record. But none of them, not even Grant, was a military president. All except Grant were civilians who had sprung to arms in the crisis of 1861 and returned to civilian life as quickly in 1865. Before they went home, however, the Army of the Potomac and Sherman's army held a grand review in Washington on May 23rd and 24th. Here we have a series of illustrations and images from the event. For 2 days, the armed might of the Republic marched in a giant parade down Pennsylvania Avenue before thousands of cheering spectators. As Sherman's long-striding Westerners came swinging by on the second day, some people in the stands began to sing John Brown's Body. The soldiers picked it up, and soon thousands of voices were thundering the great marching song of the Union armies in a city once trod by slaves, but no more. Nothing probably could have testified more appropriately to the revolution in American society that the Civil War brought about. Okay, so that does it for the Civil War. All we have left to talk about now is the period known as Reconstruction that followed it, from 1865 to 1877. And that's where we'll finish up next time for our final lecture.